What if I told you that the rotten apples everyone paid to throw away would one day produce America's most celebrated hard cider? When 31-year-old Jacob Turner inherited a struggling orchard in Oregon, he accepted truckloads of fruit nobody wanted. The entire town laughed, convinced he was destroying his future. But hidden inside his late father's forgotten journal was one sentence that changed everything. 3 years later, the same worthless apples would earn a gold medal and prove that greatness often begins where everyone else gives up. Late autumn settled gently across the rolling hills of Hood River, Oregon. Cold winds drifted down from the Cascade Mountains, carrying the scent of damp maple leaves and the last apple harvest as gray clouds lingered quietly above endless orchards. Jacob Turner had never imagined that returning home would feel more like attending a funeral than beginning a new chapter. At 31 years old, he stood just over 6 feet tall with the lean build of someone who had spent most of his adult life in classrooms rather than fields. Thick chestnut-brown hair, usually untidy from absent-minded habit, curled slightly above calm hazel eyes that always seemed to be studying the world before judging it. A short, neatly kept beard softened his angular jaw, while years of coaching high school soccer had left him healthier than most teachers his age. Friends often described Jacob as patient, thoughtful, and quietly optimistic. He preferred asking questions over giving orders and believed every person deserved another chance. Perhaps that was why his students respected him so deeply. But standing alone outside the weathered farmhouse where he had grown up, patience felt much heavier than it once had. 3 weeks earlier, Jacob had buried his father. Thomas Turner had spent nearly 40 years growing apples on 15 modest acres overlooking the Columbia River Gorge. He had never become wealthy. His tractors were older than many neighboring farmers, and almost every tool inside the barn had been repaired so many times that it seemed held together more by determination than metal. Yet throughout Hood River, everyone knew Thomas as the farmer who would stop harvesting his own orchard to help a neighbor rescue theirs before a storm arrived. His hands were rough, his words were few, but his reputation was built upon honesty rather than profit. His sudden heart attack left Jacob facing decisions he had never expected to make. He resigned from the high school where he had taught American history for nearly 7 years and drove home with little more than his father's pickup truck, several boxes of books, and uncertainty filling every mile of highway. The orchard greeted him with silence. Rows of aging apple trees stretched across the hillside beneath fading autumn leaves. Several irrigation lines leaked steadily into muddy ground. Sections of old fencing leaned dangerously after years without repair. Paint peeled from the farmhouse porch, while the roof of the equipment shed sagged beneath decades of Oregon rain. Jacob quietly walked through the orchard before sunrise each morning. He counted broken branches, dead trees, rusted equipment, bills waiting on the kitchen table. Every calculation reached the same conclusion. He simply did not have enough money. One rainy afternoon, an unfamiliar semi-truck rolled slowly into the gravel driveway. Its trailer displayed the faded logo of Cascade Valley Pressing Cooperative, one of the region's largest apple processing facilities. The driver climbed down first. Behind him came a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s named Greg Morrison, operations manager for the cooperative. Greg stood nearly 6 feet 4 with weathered skin darkened by decades beneath Oregon skies. Thick gray hair curled beneath an old baseball cap, and his square face carried the permanent seriousness of someone responsible for moving thousands of tons of fruit every harvest season. Despite his intimidating appearance, Greg spoke politely and treated everyone with straightforward respect. He removed his gloves before shaking Jacob's hand. "I'm sorry about your father." Jacob nodded quietly. "Thank you." Greg glanced toward the nearly empty fields before getting directly to the point. "We've got a problem." Jacob raised an eyebrow. Greg pointed toward the enormous trailer behind him. "Every harvest, we pay thousands of dollars hauling away apples nobody can use." Jacob looked confused. "Bruised." Greg smiled faintly. "Bruised. Too small. Too ugly. Misshapen. Some are perfectly edible. Grocery stores just won't buy them." He paused before continuing. "We heard you've got space." Jacob looked again at the trailer. "What exactly are you asking?" Greg folded his arms. "We'll dump every rejected apple here." Jacob blinked. "For free. For free. And why would I agree to that?" Greg laughed softly. "Honestly." Jacob nodded. "Because if you don't." He tapped the trailer. I'll have to pay someone else to haul them away. Jacob stared at the mountain of discarded fruit. Thousands upon thousands of apples. Red, green, golden. Many carried small bruises. Some were oddly shaped. Others looked almost perfect. He picked one up. The apple smelled sweet. He took a bite. It tasted exactly like every apple he remembered eating as a child. Only its appearance had condemned it. Greg noticed his expression. So, Jacob remained silent for nearly a minute. Finally, he smiled. Bring me all of them. Greg looked genuinely surprised. All. Jacob nodded once. Every truck. Within hours, enormous piles of rejected apples covered one corner of the old farm. By sunset, the rumors had already begun spreading across Hood River. They say Thomas Turner's boy is collecting rotten fruit. Poor kid finally lost his mind. Must be desperate. At Miller's General Store, several farmers laughed while drinking coffee. One old rancher shook his head. That teacher doesn't know the first thing about farming. Another replied with a grin. He's not farming anymore. He's running the county landfill for apples. Jacob heard none of it. He spent the evening alone inside his father's weathered equipment barn, surrounded by old tools, dust-covered shelves, and decades of forgotten memories, searching for anything that might help him understand why his father had never given up on this little orchard. The old equipment barn smelled of cedar, machine oil, and decades of forgotten harvests. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon light as Jacob Turner slowly opened cabinets his father had not touched in years. Every shelf seemed to hold another memory. Rusted pruning shears. Wooden apple crates stamped with the Turner family name. Old photographs of harvest festivals where neighbors smiled beside overflowing wagons. The silence inside the barn felt strangely comforting, as though Thomas Turner had never completely left the place he loved most. Jacob carefully moved aside a faded canvas tarp covering an old workbench. Beneath it sat a beautifully crafted wooden apple press. Unlike the modern stainless steel equipment used by large processing plants, this machine had been built almost entirely from solid white oak and cast iron. Time had darkened the wood to a rich honey color, but the frame remained remarkably sturdy. Every handle had been polished smooth by countless hands over many harvest seasons. Jacob gently ran his fingers across the worn surface. He suddenly remembered standing on a wooden crate at 8 years old while his father guided his small hands around the press handle. Never rush good cider, Thomas had whispered. The apples already know what they're becoming. At the time, Jacob thought his father was simply telling another strange farmer's story. Now those words returned with unexpected weight. Beside the press stood 6 massive oak barrels arranged carefully against the wall. Their brass bands had grown dull with age, yet none showed signs of splitting. His father had cleaned them before his final harvest, almost as though he expected someone else would one day use them again. As Jacob continued searching, he noticed a narrow wooden cabinet hidden behind stacked fruit crates. Inside rested a small leather-bound notebook. Its cover carried no title. Only 2 initials burned carefully into the leather. T.T. Jacob's heartbeat quickened. He immediately recognized his father's handwriting. Every page contained careful notes. Weather conditions, harvest dates, sugar levels, apple varieties, fermentation temperatures, observations collected across nearly 35 years. Unlike scientific textbooks, the notebook read almost like conversations between a farmer and his orchard. Rain after the first frost makes sweeter juice. Late-picked Newtown pippins soften the sharpness naturally. Listen to the barrels. They speak before they overflow. Jacob smiled despite himself. Only his father would describe fermentation that way. Hours slipped by unnoticed as he continued reading. The final pages became increasingly personal. There were fewer measurements, more reflections, thoughts about aging, about seasons, about knowing when to let something grow on its own. Finally, he reached the last page. Only one sentence had been written there. It was underlined twice. Good cider begins where perfect apples end. Jacob stared at the words for a long time. Outside, another truck unloaded thousands of rejected apples onto the farm. The sound echoed faintly through the barn. For the first time since returning home, those piles of unwanted fruit no longer looked like garbage. They looked like unfinished possibilities. That evening, Jacob rolled one of the old barrels into the center of the barn and spent hours cleaning every surface with hot water and steam, remembering how meticulous his father had always been about cleanliness. He carefully repaired loose wooden joints on the antique apple press, replaced a cracked leather gasket using spare material from the workshop, and sharpened several old tools that had not been touched in years. Near midnight, he drove into town to buy books about fermentation, yeast, and traditional hard apple cider making. The cashier looked curiously at the stack of manuals. "Starting a brewery?" he joked. Jacob smiled politely. "Not exactly." When he returned to the farm, the lights from neighboring houses glowed across the valley. From somewhere down the road, he heard laughter drifting from a local diner. News about the truckload. Winter settled quietly across Hood River as cold rain drifted through the bare apple orchards beneath heavy gray skies. The Cascade Mountains disappeared behind low clouds while icy winds carried the scent of wet earth and fermenting fruit across the silent valley. Nearly 11 months passed, and Jacob Turner began measuring time not by seasons, but by failed barrels. Every morning, he entered the old barn before sunrise carrying fresh notebooks and cautious hope. Every evening, he left smelling of apples, yeast, and disappointment. His first batch never had a chance. Believing fresh fruit alone would create great cider, Jacob crushed thousands of bruised apples, filled one of his father's oak barrels, sealed it carefully, and waited. For nearly 2 weeks, everything appeared normal. Tiny bubbles rose through the juice, and the sweet aroma filling the barn convinced him success had finally arrived. Then one cold morning he removed the lid and found thick green mold spreading across the surface like a carpet. The entire barrel had been contaminated. He dumped nearly 200 gallons onto the compost pile, watching months of work disappear into the muddy ground. The second attempt felt more promising. Jacob spent weeks reading scientific journals, sanitizing every tool twice, and controlling fermentation more carefully. This time the cider fermented vigorously. Too vigorously. One stormy night, a deafening explosion echoed across the orchard. Neighbors rushed outside believing lightning had struck the barn. Instead, they found cider spraying through broken wooden walls while shattered pieces of an oak barrel lay scattered across the floor. Pressure had built inside the sealed container until it literally exploded. By spring, the story had spread across Hood River. The crazy apple teacher blew up another barrel. Laughter followed him almost everywhere. Jacob pretended not to hear it. His third batch hurt the most because it almost succeeded. The cider looked beautiful, golden, crystal clear. He proudly poured a glass and carried it into the farmhouse where he placed his father's notebook beside him before taking the first sip. The sharp sourness forced him to spit it back into the sink immediately. The fermentation had gone badly wrong. It wasn't dangerous. It simply tasted terrible. No restaurant, no customer, no friend would ever pay for it. That evening, Jacob sat alone on the farmhouse porch staring across the orchard as rain quietly tapped against the roof. Bills continued arriving. Savings continued shrinking. Truckloads of rejected apples continued arriving every week. For the first time since returning home, he wondered whether everyone else had been right. Maybe he truly was wasting his life. A week later, someone uploaded a short video showing Jacob dumping another failed barrel behind the barn. The caption read, "The apple genius ruins another harvest." Within days, thousands of people laughed online. Some called him stubborn. Others called him delusional. Jacob never replied. He simply kept working. One rainy afternoon, an old green pickup truck slowly rolled into the driveway. The man climbing out looked every bit as weathered as the surrounding orchards. Walter Hayes was 72 years old, tall but slightly stooped, with thick white hair tucked beneath a faded wool cap and a full silver beard that reached the collar of his heavy canvas jacket. Deep brown eyes rested beneath bushy eyebrows, carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime solving problems without raising his voice. His hands were scarred by decades of barrel making and cider production, their skin permanently stained by oak tannins and apple juice. Throughout Oregon, older cider makers still spoke respectfully of Walter. 20 years earlier, his handcrafted hard cider had won multiple national championships before he unexpectedly retired after his wife, Eleanor, passed away following a long battle with cancer. Since then, he had quietly disappeared from public life, rarely speaking at festivals or competitions. Walter looked around the orchard before smiling faintly. "So, you must be Jacob." Jacob wiped his hands on an old towel. "I am." Walter nodded toward the growing mountains of discarded apples. "Mind if an old cider maker looks around?" Jacob welcomed him without hesitation. They spent nearly an hour walking through the orchard. Walter asked surprisingly few questions. Instead, he watched. He picked up apples, smelled them, cut several open, listened while Jacob described every failed batch without hiding his mistakes. When Jacob finally finished, he sighed. "I think I'm missing the recipe." Walter laughed quietly. "No." He picked up 3 apples from the same crate. One tart, one sweet, one bitter. He handed them to Jacob. "You're missing the conversation." Jacob frowned. Walter sliced each apple. Different apples speak different languages. He pointed toward the tart fruit. "This one brings brightness." Then the sweet one. "This one brings body." Finally, the bitter apple. "This one gives character." He looked directly into Jacob's eyes. "You've been treating every apple as though they're identical." They aren't. Walter never offered a written formula, never measured exact ingredients, never claimed there was only one correct answer. Instead, he taught Jacob something far more valuable. Every morning, they sorted apples into separate wooden crates. Sweet, sharp, bittersweet, aromatic. Jacob recorded everything inside a brand new notebook. Weather, temperature, sugar levels, fermentation speed, aroma changes, barrel behavior. Walter insisted every observation mattered. One evening, Jacob asked why he refused to give him his award-winning recipe. Walter smiled toward the quietly fermenting barrels. "Because if I give you my recipe, you'll only learn to copy me." He gently tapped one oak barrel. "But if you learn to listen, you'll someday make cider better than mine." For the first time in nearly a year, Jacob looked across the old orchard without seeing failure. He saw thousands of apples waiting patiently to tell their own story. Spring arrived in Hood River beneath dark skies that refused to clear. Heavy clouds rolled over the Cascade Mountains day after day, and relentless rains soaked the orchards until every hillside glistened beneath sheets of cold water. Farmers who had prayed for a gentle growing season instead watched the weather turn into something they had not seen in decades. The storm lasted nearly 5 days. Power lines collapsed across rural roads. Flooded irrigation ditches overflowed into neighboring fields. Branches snapped beneath violent winds, leaving thousands of apple trees scarred before summer had even begun. Jacob Turner stood beside Walter Hayes outside the old barn, silently watching another truck struggle through the mud toward the orchard. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Walter sighed. "This storm will change everything." Jacob looked toward the damaged hillsides stretching across the valley. "I know, but maybe not the way people think." Within a week, the consequences became obvious. The surviving apples were covered with small bruises caused by hail and broken branches. Many remained perfectly healthy inside, but supermarkets rejected enormous quantities because they no longer looked attractive enough for store shelves. Processing plants also rejected thousands of additional loads that failed strict cosmetic grading. Every orchard owner suddenly faced the same expensive problem: mountains of apples no one wanted. Greg Morrison arrived once again at Jacob's farm, driving the same aging semi-truck. This time, 3 more trucks followed behind him. Greg climbed down, shaking his head. "I've never seen anything like this." He pointed toward the trailers. "We're throwing away nearly 4 times more fruit than usual." Jacob looked at the endless rows of wooden bins. "I'll take all of it." Greg stared at him. "You don't even know how much there is." Jacob smiled. "I know exactly how much hope looks like." For the next several weeks, truck after truck entered the Turner orchard. Workers unloaded bruised Honeycrisp apples, misshapen Newtown Pippins, wind-damaged Arkansas Blacks, golden russets marked by hail. Every variety was carefully separated before entering the barn. The neighbors believed Jacob had finally guaranteed his own bankruptcy. He couldn't sell all that cider in 10 years. "He's buried under rotten fruit." Poor kid never learned when to quit. Jacob ignored every comment. Inside the barn, the atmosphere had completely changed. Walter had transformed one corner into a careful fermentation workspace. Wooden signs labeled each apple variety. Large notebooks recorded harvest dates, sugar content, acidity, and natural aroma. Every barrel carried handwritten notes rather than simple numbers. Jacob no longer hurried. Instead, he treated every batch almost like introducing old friends to one another. Some barrels combined sweet apples with sharply acidic varieties. Others relied upon naturally bitter fruit to create greater depth. Nothing received added sugar. Nothing received artificial flavors. Nothing was rushed. Walter watched quietly one afternoon before smiling. You've stopped making cider. Jacob looked confused. I have. Walter nodded. Now you're raising it. Late that summer, an unexpected visitor arrived. Her name was Professor Amelia Chun, 54 years old, one of the leading fermentation scientists at the University of Oregon. Slightly above average height with an athletic build from years of field research, Amelia wore her short black hair neatly tucked beneath a waterproof field hat. Thin silver-framed glasses rested before intelligent dark brown eyes that constantly observed tiny details others overlooked. Her calm voice reflected decades spent teaching graduate students, while her curiosity had earned her international respect in food microbiology. Although highly accomplished, she remained remarkably humble and preferred listening before offering opinions. She introduced herself simply. I watched a chef in Portland describe your cider. Jacob looked surprised. I haven't advertised. She smiled. The best products rarely need to. Amelia spent 2 full days examining Jacob's operation. She collected yeast samples, measured acidity, studied fermentation temperatures, reviewed every notebook Jacob had filled under Walter's guidance. Occasionally, she stopped reading and quietly smiled to herself. On the second afternoon, she finally closed the final notebook. I think you should know something. Jacob waited. You've accidentally rebuilt one of the oldest cider traditions in Europe. Walter folded his arms, but said nothing. Amelia continued. Your slow natural fermentation allows native yeast from the orchard to develop gradually instead of forcing rapid fermentation with commercial methods. She pointed toward the barrels. You don't add refined sugar. Jacob nodded. No. No artificial flavoring. No. No chemical shortcuts. Again, Jacob shook his head. We only use the apples. Amelia smiled warmly. Most companies try to control fermentation. She gently touched one oak barrel. You've learned to cooperate with it. Walter quietly laughed. I told him to listen. Amelia looked toward the old cider maker. It appears he finally did. News traveled surprisingly fast. A Portland chef named Marco Alvarez, a 42-year-old award-winning restaurant owner known for his refined palate and thick dark beard, drove 3 hours simply to taste Jacob's latest batch. Marco had built his reputation serving locally sourced ingredients and believed extraordinary food always began with extraordinary farmers. After one careful sip, he lowered the glass. I'll take every bottle you can produce. Jacob blinked. Every bottle. Marco smiled. And when you make more, I'll buy those too. As autumn approached once again, Jacob noticed something remarkable. The old barn no longer smelled like failure. It smelled like fresh apples, aging oak, quiet patience, and the beginning of a future neither he nor his father had ever dared imagine. Golden autumn returned to Hood River beneath brilliant blue skies. Cool mountain air drifted through orchards glowing with shades of crimson, amber, and gold while the Cascade Peaks stood quietly above the valley. The same hills that had once echoed with laughter at Jacob Turner's failures now watched something far more remarkable begin to unfold. Business had improved steadily throughout the year. Every Friday morning, Chef Marco Alvarez's refrigerated truck arrived at the Turner farm before sunrise. Restaurants in Portland were ordering more bottles than Jacob could comfortably produce. Yet Walter Hayes never allowed him to sacrifice quality for speed. Never chase demand. Walter reminded him one evening while inspecting another oak barrel. Make something worth waiting for. Jacob followed that advice without question. One afternoon, Professor Amelia Chun returned carrying a thick envelope. She placed it gently on the old wooden table beside the cider barrels. You've spent 2 years proving your cider belongs among the best. Jacob looked at the envelope. So, Amelia smiled. Now let someone else say it. Inside was an application for the Great American International Cider Competition, one of the country's most respected cider competitions. Jacob laughed nervously. You've got to be kidding. I can't compete with companies producing hundreds of thousands of bottles. Walter quietly folded his arms. They produce cider. He looked toward the barrels. You produce character. Jacob still hesitated. What if everyone discovers it isn't good enough? Walter smiled. You've already survived people laughing at you. What else are you afraid of? Several weeks later, Jacob carefully selected only 3 bottles from his favorite barrel. No fancy packaging. No expensive labels. Only a simple cream-colored tag bearing the words Turner Orchard Reserve. Natural hard apple cider. He packed the bottles himself before driving to the competition venue with almost no expectations. The judging lasted 2 full days. Jacob returned home without waiting for the results. He honestly believed participating had already been enough. 3 weeks later, while cleaning barrels inside the barn, his cell phone rang. An unfamiliar number appeared. Mr. Turner? Yes. This is the Great American International Cider Competition. Jacob stopped working. We're pleased to inform you. There was a brief pause. Your traditional natural hard cider has been awarded the gold medal. Jacob remained completely silent. He honestly thought he had misunderstood. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that? The woman laughed warmly. You won. The highest score in your category. The phone slowly slipped from Jacob's hand onto the workbench. Walter immediately recognized his expression. Without asking a single question, the old cider maker smiled. You finally listened. By the following morning, newspapers across Oregon carried the story. Former teacher wins national gold with rejected apples. Regional television stations arrived first. Then national reporters. Journalists wandered through the old barn filming the antique apple press, the oak barrels, and the handwritten notebooks filled with years of careful observations. One interviewer held up a bruised apple. You really made America's best cider from fruit most companies throw away? Jacob nodded. The apples were never the problem. He gently turned the apple in his hand. We simply judged them too quickly. Within days, the story spread far beyond Oregon. Agricultural magazines, food documentaries, national morning television programs. Everyone wanted to interview the farmer who had transformed discarded apples into an award-winning cider. Orders flooded in faster than Jacob could answer emails. Restaurants placed reservations months in advance. Specialty stores across the country requested distribution agreements. Large beverage corporations offered lucrative contracts to purchase his brand. Jacob politely declined every one of them. Walter watched with quiet satisfaction. I was wondering when the money would come. Jacob smiled. It came. I'm just choosing what matters more. Not everyone arrived carrying business contracts. One rainy afternoon, an old pickup stopped quietly outside the barn. Then another. By evening, nearly a dozen small orchard owners stood together beneath the porch. Many looked uncomfortably embarrassed. Jacob recognized several faces immediately. Some had laughed at him years earlier. One elderly grower removed his cap. I owe you an apology. Another looked down at his boots. We thought you were wasting your life. A younger farmer stepped forward. We've started getting more rejected apples too. He hesitated before continuing. Would you teach us? Walter quietly looked toward Jacob without saying a word. The decision belonged entirely to him. Jacob smiled. Come back Saturday morning. Everyone looked surprised. We'll start with cleaning barrels. The following weekend, the old barn filled with people instead of silence. Jacob taught sanitation before fermentation. He explained why different apple varieties should never simply be mixed together. He showed farmers how to measure patience before measuring profit. Walter occasionally interrupted with stories from 50 years earlier, making everyone laugh while quietly passing along wisdom that no textbook contained. Nobody paid tuition. Nobody signed contracts. Coffee sat beside notebooks. Questions replaced pride. Friendship slowly replaced competition. Before leaving each afternoon, every farmer received copies of Jacob's handwritten fermentation logs. One visitor finally asked him why he was giving away everything he had worked so hard to learn. Jacob looked toward his father's old notebook resting beside the antique apple press. My father never taught me to protect knowledge. He taught me to protect people. Outside, another truck unloaded bruised apples onto the farm. This time, no one laughed. Instead, several neighboring farmers hurried over to help unload them, already imagining what those forgotten apples might someday become. 3 years later, autumn returned to Hood River with the same crisp mountain air that had greeted Jacob Turner on the day he first accepted a truckload of unwanted apples. Golden leaves danced across the orchard beneath a clear blue sky, and cool breezes drifted down from the Cascade Mountains carrying the familiar scent of ripe fruit, damp earth, and aging oak barrels. Yet everything else had changed. The old Turner orchard no longer stood alone. Across Oregon and southern Washington, hundreds of family-owned orchards had adopted the methods Jacob and Walter Hayes once developed inside a quiet, weathered barn. Every harvest season, Trucks that had once carried rejected apples to landfills now delivered them to small cider houses where local families transformed forgotten fruit into award-winning hard cider. What had once been considered agricultural waste had become one of the region's most valuable resources. Industry reports estimated that thousands of tons of apples previously discarded each year were now being used instead of buried. Processing companies saved millions of dollars in disposal costs, while small farming communities found new sources of income without planting a single additional tree. For Jacob, however, the greatest reward could never be measured in dollars. Every Saturday morning, his barn filled with people, young farmers, retired orchard owners, college students studying sustainable agriculture, entire families hoping to keep their farms alive. The old wooden apple press still stood near the entrance, carefully restored but rarely used for production anymore. Instead, it reminded visitors where everything had begun. Above it hung a simple wooden sign carved by Jacob's own hands. Nothing is wasted until we stop believing in it. People often stopped reading it before entering. Many quietly photographed it before leaving. One October afternoon, a documentary crew from a national public television network arrived to film the remarkable transformation of Hood River's cider industry. Leading the production was Nathan Collins, a 50-year-old documentary journalist known throughout America for telling stories about ordinary people creating extraordinary change. Tall and lean with neatly combed gray hair, thoughtful blue eyes, and a calm voice that immediately put nervous interview subjects at ease. Nathan had spent nearly 3 decades traveling through rural communities searching for stories rarely found in headlines. He believed the best interviews happened when people forgot the cameras existed. Instead of beginning inside the award-winning cider house, Nathan asked Jacob to walk through the orchard. The cameras remained several yards behind as they slowly moved between rows of apple trees. Nathan finally asked the question that almost every reporter eventually asked. Looking around today, what's the greatest thing your father left you? Jacob stopped beside one of the oldest apple trees his father had planted decades earlier. Its branches still produced fruit every autumn. He gently rested one weathered hand against the rough bark. For several long seconds, he simply smiled. It wasn't the recipe. His eyes wandered toward the old barn, where Walter was teaching another group of young farmers. It wasn't the orchard. It wasn't even the cider. Nathan waited quietly. Jacob finally continued. My father taught me something much more valuable. He picked up a bruised apple lying beneath the tree. Most people would have walked past it. Jacob carefully turned it in his hand. He gave me the courage to see value, where everyone else only saw waste. Silence settled across the orchard. Even the camera crew remained perfectly still. When the documentary aired several weeks later, millions of Americans watched the interview. They saw children helping parents sort imperfect apples, small family farms reopening after years of financial struggle, former competitors working together instead of against one another. Communities that had once viewed rejected fruit as expensive garbage now celebrated it as opportunity. Tourists soon began arriving from across the country, not simply to taste Jacob's award-winning cider. They came to learn. Restaurants organized educational tours. Agricultural universities sent research teams. Young entrepreneurs arrived carrying notebooks instead of business plans. Jacob welcomed every visitor exactly the same way. Coffee was always free. Questions were always encouraged. Knowledge was never sold. Walter Hayes officially retired that winter. Before leaving the cider house for the final time, he quietly handed Jacob his old leather apron. I don't need this anymore. Jacob looked at the worn leather covered with decades of stains. You earned this. Walter smiled warmly. So did you. The following spring, Jacob carefully hung the apron beside his father's notebook and the old apple press. 3 generations now stood together on one wall, not because of trophies, but because each had chosen to leave something behind for the next generation. Years later, visitors no longer asked where the rejected apples had come from. They no longer remembered the jokes told inside coffee shops. They no longer remembered the videos mocking the young teacher who filled his farm with fruit nobody wanted. Instead, they remembered something far more important. They remembered that one ordinary farmer had looked at what the world called worthless and found enough hope inside it to change an entire industry. Sometimes, God's greatest miracles don't begin with perfection. Sometimes they begin with what the world has already thrown away. Just as Jacob found extraordinary value in apples everyone else rejected, God often sees purpose in people who feel forgotten, broken, or overlooked. Maybe today, someone around you simply needs a little encouragement, a second chance, or someone willing to believe in them. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who could use a little hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from or what part of this story inspired you the most. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more uplifting stories of faith, resilience, and second chances. May God bless you, your family, your work, and everyone you love with peace, hope, and abundant blessings.